Sometimes the safest place in the universe isn't behind an army or inside a fortress. Sometimes it's behind an old wooden garage where nobody thinks to look. Ethan Carter had always believed that silence carried its own language. After 15 years restoring old farmhouses and weathered barns across rural Montana, he had learned to hear the difference between ordinary nighttime sounds and the kind that made the back of his neck tighten. The steady ticking of rain against cedar shingles meant another cool autumn evening. The distant call of an owl belonged to the forest beyond his property. The low groan of old timber settling into the cold had become as familiar as breathing. But the faint scrape that drifted from behind his detached garage just after 2 o'clock in the morning belonged to none of those things. He set his coffee mug down beside the kitchen sink and stood still. The motion sensor light outside had never turned on. Whatever had made the noise had either stayed perfectly still or somehow avoided the sensor completely. Ethan pulled on his brown work jacket and stepped onto the back porch. The October air carried the smell of wet pine, fresh soil, and the lingering scent of sawdust that always surrounded his workshop. His boots pressed softly into damp gravel as he crossed the backyard. A weak yellow light spilled from the porch, leaving most of the property wrapped in darkness. His garage stood near the tree line, its weathered wooden walls silvered by decades of mountain winters. The building had been there long before he bought the property, and every spring he promised himself he would replace the sagging rear fence behind it. Every spring something else demanded attention instead. As he rounded the corner, his flashlight swept across stacked lumber, rusted gardening tools, and an old aluminum ladder leaning against the wall. Then the beam stopped. Someone was sleeping behind the garage, curled tightly beneath the narrow overhang. The stranger looked impossibly still, as if she feared even breathing too loudly. A thin silver cloak shimmered faintly beneath the flashlight before becoming almost invisible again. Ethan lowered the beam. Immediately, he had never seen fabric behave like that. For a brief moment, he wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. Then the young woman stirred. Long hair the color of pale moonlight slipped across her shoulder. Her face looked almost human, yet something about it felt quietly different. Her features possessed an unusual symmetry that seemed untouched by age or hardship. Her skin carried a soft ivory glow beneath the rain-soaked darkness, neither pale from illness nor bright with makeup, but naturally luminous like polished pearl beneath morning light. Her closed eyes fluttered once before opening. Golden irises reflected the flashlight with a faint inner ring that no human eye could produce. Ethan forgot to breathe. She did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she looked directly at him with exhausted caution, studying his expression before his clothes, his boots, and finally the steaming mug still clutched in his left hand. Her gaze lingered on it as though warmth itself had become a forgotten memory. Very slowly she tried to sit up, but her body trembled from fatigue. Ethan instinctively took one careful step backward instead of forward. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him for several long seconds. Rain tapped gently against the garage roof above them, while somewhere beyond the trees a freight train sounded its lonely horn across the valley. The woman swallowed with visible effort before speaking in careful English touched by an unfamiliar melody. "Please." Her voice was barely louder than the rain. "Please don't send me back." The words landed with unexpected weight. Ethan had heard fear before. He had volunteered after floods and wildfires, helping families rebuild homes they thought they had lost forever. He recognized panic. He recognized grief. But what he heard inside those 6 words was something deeper than either. It sounded like someone who had already accepted that no one would believe her. Ethan glanced toward the open fields surrounding his property. Nothing moved except rain drifting across the pasture. No headlights approached the gravel road. No helicopters crossed the clouds. Everything looked ordinary. Yet the woman's eyes kept searching the sky instead of the ground, as if danger could descend from above without warning. Ethan followed her gaze. Hidden beyond thick storm clouds, something flashed once. Not lightning. Too steady. Too distant. Before he could focus on it, the faint glow disappeared completely. When he looked back, the woman had wrapped her arms around herself again, shrinking into the narrow strip of shadow behind the garage. The damaged cloak resting across her shoulders pulsed once before falling silent. Whatever system had guided her there had exhausted the last of its power. Thick timber, aging steel supports, and the unusually low level of electronic interference surrounding the old garage had created a rare blind spot that long-range orbital scanners struggled to resolve. She had not chosen Ethan Carter. She had only chosen the safest place her failing equipment could still find. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan suddenly understood why she had chosen that exact place. It was the only corner of the property invisible from the open sky. Ethan kept his eyes on the young woman for another long moment before speaking again. The rain had softened into a fine mist, coating the old cedar boards of the garage with tiny beads of water that reflected the porch light like scattered stars. He slowly set his flashlight on the ground, letting its beam point harmlessly toward the gravel instead of her face. It was a simple gesture, but he hoped she would understand that he was choosing trust before questions. She noticed. Her shoulders relaxed just enough for him to see the difference. "You look cold," he said quietly. "I have coffee if you drink it. Hot tea if you do not. I also have soup." She blinked, as though the offer itself seemed unfamiliar. After several seconds, she answered with careful hesitation. Water would be enough. Ethan nodded once and walked back toward the house without looking over his shoulder. Every instinct told him that if she believed he was trying to trap her, she would disappear before he returned. Inside the kitchen, he filled a large insulated bottle with fresh water and gathered a clean wool blanket from the hallway closet. He hesitated before picking up his old first aid kit as well. Years of helping neighbors had taught him that people who insisted they were fine usually were not. When he stepped outside again, she had not moved. She remained seated beneath the overhang, watching the dark sky through the narrow gap between the garage roof and the pine trees. Ethan stopped several feet away and gently placed the bottle, the blanket, and the medical kit on a dry section of concrete before taking 2 slow steps back. "These are yours if you want them," he said. "No strings attached." The woman stared at the items for several moments before cautiously reaching for the water. Her hands were elegant but trembling from exhaustion. She twisted the cap with visible effort and drank slowly, as though afraid her body might reject too much too quickly. When she finished, she closed her eyes for a brief second. Relief crossed her face so quietly that Ethan almost missed it. "Thank you," she whispered. Her English sounded smoother now, every word pronounced with unusual precision. Ethan noticed that she never asked where she was. She seemed more interested in whether anyone else knew she had been found. "My name is Ethan," he said. "You do not have to tell me yours tonight." She looked at him with surprise. Most people, he imagined, would have demanded answers immediately. Instead, he simply waited. The silence stretched comfortably between them, filled only by dripping rain and the distant rustling of pine branches. Finally she spoke. "Lyra." The name carried a gentle musical rhythm unlike anything he had heard before. "Lyra," Ethan repeated carefully. She gave the smallest nod. "It has been a long time since someone said my name without fear." The sentence lingered in the cool night air. Ethan did not know what it meant, but he recognized the loneliness behind it. His eyes drifted toward the strange silver cloak resting around her shoulders. Up close he could see that it was not cloth at all. Countless microscopic patterns shimmered beneath its surface like frost spreading across a window, adjusting their color to match the weathered wood behind her. It was remarkable technology, yet somehow damaged. Tiny sections flickered irregularly before fading again. Lyra noticed where he was looking and instinctively pulled the cloak closer around herself. "It is failing," she admitted quietly. "It cannot hide me much longer." Ethan followed her gaze upward once more. The clouds had begun to thin, revealing scattered stars across the Montana sky. Lyra studied them with growing concern instead of wonder. Her expression changed the moment one particular point of light appeared above the eastern horizon. Unlike the others, it remained perfectly steady. Too bright, too deliberate. She inhaled sharply. "They are searching," she whispered almost to herself. Ethan looked again, but from where he stood it appeared no different from an ordinary star. Still, something inside him trusted her reaction more than his own eyes. He glanced back toward the warm lights glowing inside his farmhouse. The spare room above the garage had not been used since his father passed away several years earlier. Dust covered the old furniture, but the roof did not leak and the small wood stove still worked. He made his decision before logic had time to argue with it. "You cannot stay out here tonight," he said gently. Lyra immediately shook her head. The house is visible. Ethan looked around the property, then toward the narrow staircase that climbed along the inside wall of the garage. A thoughtful smile crossed his face. Then we will not use the house. We will use the place nobody ever notices. For the first time since he found her, the fear in Lyra's eyes gave way to something smaller, quieter, and almost forgotten. Hope. The narrow wooden staircase groaned softly beneath Ethan's boots as he climbed toward the small room above the garage. The familiar smell of aged pine, machine oil, and dry cedar greeted him before he unlocked the old door. It had been nearly 3 years since anyone had slept there. Moonlight filtered through the dusty window, revealing furniture hidden beneath white cotton sheets and tiny particles drifting lazily through the cool air. Ethan opened the window just enough to let fresh mountain air inside before lighting a small lantern. Warm amber light slowly pushed the shadows into the corners. He folded the sheets away, uncovered the narrow bed, and brushed away the thin layer of dust with an old shop towel. Down below, Lyra remained motionless near the garage wall, watching every sound and movement with quiet caution. When Ethan returned a few minutes later, he simply pointed toward the staircase. "Nobody comes up here," he said. "Not even the delivery drivers know this room exists." Lyra studied the weathered wooden steps with uncertainty. "Is it hidden from above?" she asked. Ethan looked through the open garage doorway toward the night sky before nodding. "The roof is thick, solid timber. My father built it long before satellites became common." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, almost as if calculating invisible distances. Finally she stood. Even after everything she had endured, she carried herself with quiet grace. She was taller than Ethan had first realized, yet every movement remained gentle and controlled, as though she had been taught from childhood that dignity should never disappear, even during hardship. She climbed each step carefully, pausing only once to glance back through the open garage door at the stars above. Inside the room, she stopped just beyond the doorway. Her golden eyes slowly moved across every detail. The old wooden bookshelf, the iron stove resting silently in one corner, a faded baseball glove hanging from a nail beside an old family photograph, the handmade quilt folded neatly across the bed. She reached toward the quilt without touching it. "Someone loved this place," she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "My father did." Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt different, less fearful, more thoughtful. Ethan knelt beside the small cast-iron stove and added a few pieces of seasoned pine from the storage box nearby. Within minutes, a gentle fire crackled behind the glass door, filling the room with steady warmth. Lyra instinctively stepped closer. She extended one hand toward the heat, studying the dancing flames with open curiosity. "Your civilization still burns wood," she observed. "Sometimes," Ethan answered with a small laugh. "Not because we have to. Because some things simply feel like home." She considered his words carefully, almost filing them away beside countless other observations. "Home," she repeated softly. "That word exists in every known language. Yet it means something different everywhere." Ethan noticed her eyes wandering toward the family photograph resting on the shelf. It showed a younger version of himself beside an older man holding a freshly carved rocking chair. "Your father?" she asked. "Yes." Ethan nodded. "He taught me how to build things that last longer than people." Lyra looked at the worn wooden beams overhead. "He succeeded." Ethan smiled again, surprised by how naturally the conversation had begun. He walked downstairs once more and returned carrying a simple tray with vegetable soup, homemade bread, and a small ceramic mug filled with warm herbal tea. The aroma immediately filled the room. Lyra stared at the meal with quiet disbelief. "For me?" she asked. "You need to eat," Ethan replied. She hesitated before taking the spoon. Her movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as if accepting food from another person carried deep meaning where she came from. After the first bite, she closed her eyes. Not because of the taste alone, but because of the warmth. Ethan pretended not to notice the tears quietly gathering at the corners of her eyes. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pine trees, carrying the distant scent of approaching frost. High above the farmhouse, hidden beyond ordinary sight, a tiny point of pale light drifted silently across the night sky before stopping directly over the valley. Lyra did not see it. For the first time in many nights, She had finally allowed herself to feel safe enough to lower her guard. Icy sunlight filtered through the small attic window long before Ethan heard the first sound from outside. A rooster crowed somewhere across the neighboring pasture, followed by the familiar rumble of an old pickup truck traveling along the county road. Morning arrived with ordinary rhythms, but nothing about the previous night had been ordinary. Ethan quietly climbed the stairs carrying a fresh towel, a folded flannel shirt, a pair of blue jeans, and thick wool socks that had belonged to his father. He tapped gently on the half-open door before stepping inside. The small wood stove still glowed with fading embers, filling the room with comforting warmth. Lyra sat beside the window, wrapped in the handmade quilt, watching thin ribbons of morning fog drift between the pine trees. She had not slept in the bed. Instead, she had chosen the wooden rocking chair facing the sky. Her eyes looked calmer than before, yet they still searched every distant movement beyond the hills. Ethan placed the folded clothes on the old cedar chest beside her. "They may not fit perfectly," he said with an apologetic smile, "but they will be warmer than what you have now." Lyra looked down at the neatly folded garments with quiet curiosity. She gently touched the flannel fabric between two fingers, studying its texture as though it were something rare. "Natural fibers," she murmured. "Your people still value them." Ethan chuckled softly, "especially when winter is coming." She looked at him, puzzled by the expression. "Winter always comes," she answered with complete sincerity. Ethan laughed a little harder, and for the first time Lyra tilted her head in confusion before realizing he was not mocking her. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips. It was small, hesitant, almost uncertain how to exist, but it transformed her entire face. Ethan realized it was probably the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in a very long time. He stepped back toward the staircase. "There is a bathroom inside the house. You can use it while nobody is around. The nearest neighbor is almost half a mile away, and nobody visits this early." Lyra hesitated. "The house is still visible." "Only for a few minutes," Ethan replied. "Sometimes we have to trust timing more than hiding." Several minutes later, she quietly followed him through the back entrance. Every object inside the farmhouse seemed to capture her attention. The refrigerator hummed softly. A coffee maker released gentle clouds of steam. Sunlight spilled across the worn oak dining table where Ethan's father had once repaired broken clocks. During quiet evenings, Lyra paused beside the refrigerator and listened carefully. "It sings," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "That is just the compressor." She nodded thoughtfully, apparently satisfied with the explanation. After changing into the borrowed clothes, she emerged looking unexpectedly comfortable. The oversized flannel shirt reached nearly to her knees, while the rolled sleeves exposed only her hands. Ethan noticed she stood a little straighter now, less like someone running, more like someone remembering how to breathe. They shared breakfast in comfortable silence. Fresh scrambled eggs, toast with homemade blackberry jam, and warm herbal tea replaced the fear that had filled the previous night. Lyra carefully observed every step before tasting each unfamiliar food. The blackberry jam fascinated her most. "This fruit grows naturally?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Along the fence every August." She stared at the small glass jar with genuine amazement. Entire civilizations have crossed star systems searching for flavors less remarkable than this. Ethan laughed again, assuming she was exaggerating. Lyra did not laugh. To her, it was simply the truth. As the morning continued, Ethan returned to his workshop to finish restoring an old rocking chair promised to a customer in town. The steady rhythm of sandpaper against aged oak echoed through the garage. After several minutes, he sensed someone quietly watching. Lyra stood in the doorway, studying every movement of his hands. She watched the wood shavings curl away from the blade, the careful measurements, the patient sanding, and the final touch of warm linseed oil soaking into the grain. "You repair what time tries to erase," she said softly. Ethan looked up and smiled. "That is one way of putting it." Lyra stepped closer, running her fingertips just above the polished wood without touching it. "Where I come from," she whispered, "nothing is repaired. It is simply replaced." Ethan gently set the chair upright. "Maybe that is why people stop valuing things." Lyra lowered her eyes. His simple answer lingered inside her far longer than he realized, because somewhere deep within her own world, she had begun to fear that people had become just as replaceable as broken machines. The afternoon drifted across the valley with the unhurried rhythm only small towns seemed to understand. Golden sunlight spilled through the workshop windows, warming the scent of fresh pine and linseed oil until the entire garage felt alive with memories. Ethan sanded the final edge of the restored rocking chair, while Lyra wandered quietly through the workshop, her curious eyes lingering on shelves filled with hand planes, chisels, antique clocks, and carefully labeled jars of screws collected over decades. She examined everything with the fascination of someone discovering an unfamiliar civilization through its smallest details rather than its greatest inventions. "You keep broken things," she observed softly as she picked up an old brass hinge that had long since lost its shine. Ethan smiled without looking up. "Sometimes people throw away something that only needs a little patience." She rolled the weathered hinge gently between her fingers before placing it exactly where she had found it. "Where I was raised, efficiency was considered a higher virtue than patience." Ethan brushed away another curl of wood shavings. "Maybe that is why your people build better machines, and we tell better stories." Lyra looked at him with thoughtful silence, as if weighing the sentence against years of lessons she had been taught since childhood. Outside, a gentle breeze carried dry leaves across the gravel driveway, their soft scraping interrupted only by the distant hum of a passing crop duster several miles away. The ordinary sounds settled over the property like a comforting blanket. For the first time since arriving, Lyra seemed willing to believe that ordinary life truly existed. She stepped toward the open garage door and closed her eyes, allowing the cool mountain air to brush across her face. "Your world breathes slowly," she whispered. "Mine never learned how." Ethan set down the sanding block and joined her near the doorway. "Maybe that is why people come out here. To remember that life is not supposed to move as fast as the clock says." Lyra lowered her gaze to the grass growing between the old fence posts. Tiny wildflowers had forced their way through cracks in the hard earth, blooming without permission or recognition. She watched a honeybee settle gently onto one of the blossoms before lifting back into the afternoon sunlight. Her expression softened. "Nobody protects them," she said. "Yet they continue." Ethan nodded. "Nature usually figures things out before we do." As she turned back toward the workshop, something beneath the collar of the oversized flannel shirt caught Ethan's attention. For just a fraction of a second, a thin metallic band shimmered against the side of her neck before disappearing beneath the fabric again. It was not jewelry. Its surface reflected light with the same strange living texture as her damaged cloak. Lyra noticed his eyes immediately. Instinctively, she reached for the collar, but she was a moment too late. Ethan gently raised one hand. "You do not have to explain if you are not ready." She remained perfectly still. The silence stretched until even the breeze outside seemed to pause. Finally, she drew a slow breath and pulled the collar aside just enough to reveal the object completely. A slender silver ring encircled the base of her neck. It rested against her skin without any visible clasp or seam. Tiny patterns of pale blue light flowed silently beneath its polished surface like distant rivers seen from orbit. Ethan had never imagined technology so elegant could also appear so heavy. "It is not decoration," Lyra said quietly. "I guess that." She looked toward the open sky beyond the garage before continuing. "It was placed on me many years ago. It listens. It measures. It remembers where I am supposed to be." Ethan frowned slightly. "Like a tracking device?" Lyra hesitated before giving the smallest nod. "More than that." Her fingers brushed the silver band with obvious reluctance. "As long as it functions, they can eventually find me." Ethan studied the delicate ring again. There were no screws, no hinges, no visible source of power. It appeared almost fused with her skin. "Can it be removed?" he asked. Lyra looked at him with quiet sadness. Nobody has ever asked that question before. Ethan met her gaze without speaking. He was not thinking like an engineer or a scientist. He was thinking like the son of a craftsman who had spent his entire life believing that anything made by hands could someday be repaired, restored, or carefully taken apart. For the first time since leaving her distant home, Lyra saw something inside Ethan's steady blue eyes that none of the greatest minds in her civilization had ever offered her. Not certainty, not power, simply the quiet belief that impossible problems deserved patient hands before surrender. The silver band remained untouched for the rest of the afternoon, yet its silent presence seemed to follow every conversation. Ethan did not ask another question about it. He understood that trust, once rushed, often disappeared just as quickly. Instead, he returned to the rocking chair waiting on his workbench and carefully rubbed the final coat of oil into the weathered oak. Lyra watched him without speaking. She seemed fascinated that he could spend nearly an hour improving an object most people would never examine closely. Every careful movement of his hands appeared to challenge everything she had been taught about efficiency. As the sun drifted lower behind the western hills, long golden rays stretched across the workshop floor, turning drifting sawdust into floating specks of light. The peaceful silence was interrupted by the distant rumble of an engine approaching along the gravel road. Ethan glanced toward the driveway without concern. "Probably my neighbor," he said. "Tom usually borrows tools when he forgets to plan ahead." The truck slowed as it reached the mailbox before turning into the driveway. An aging blue pickup rolled to a stop beside the workshop. Tom Harrison climbed out carrying his usual baseball cap and easy smile. He was retired, endlessly curious, and knew nearly everyone within 30 miles. "Afternoon, Ethan," he called while walking toward the open garage. "Hope I am not interrupting anything." Ethan smiled and wiped his hands on an old shop towel. "Only arguing with an old rocking chair." Tom laughed warmly before his eyes wandered across the workshop. Lyra had already stepped behind one of the tall storage shelves, hidden from direct view. Ethan noticed the movement, but kept his expression calm. "I came to return that socket wrench I borrowed last month," Tom said, placing the tool on the workbench. "Also wanted to let you know there were some unusual government vehicles parked near the highway this morning. Black sport utility vehicles. No local plates. Folks at the diner have been talking about them all day." Ethan felt a quiet tension settle in the room. "Any idea what they were doing?" Tom shrugged. "Nobody knows. They asked a few strange questions. Mostly whether anyone had reported unusual lights in the sky over the past week." Behind the storage shelves, Lyra stood completely motionless. Even her breathing became almost impossible to notice. Ethan casually picked up the returned wrench and slipped it into the toolbox. "People around here always think every satellite is a flying saucer," he replied with an easy smile. Tom chuckled. "That is true enough." After another few minutes of ordinary conversation about weather, firewood, and the upcoming harvest festival, Tom climbed back into his truck and disappeared down the gravel road. The familiar sound of the engine slowly faded into the distance. Only after complete silence returned did Lyra step out from behind the shelves. Her face had lost all the calm she had found during the past day. She looked toward the empty driveway as though expecting more vehicles to appear at any moment. Ethan closed the garage door halfway, leaving only a narrow strip of evening sunlight beneath it. "Do you think those people were looking for you?" he asked gently. Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the open side window and looked upward. The sky had become brilliantly clear after the previous night's rain. Hundreds of stars would soon appear. "They are not my people," she finally whispered. "But once someone begins asking questions, answers usually follow." Ethan leaned quietly against the workbench. "Then we will be careful." Lyra slowly shook her head. "You still do not understand." Her golden eyes settled on the silver band resting around her neck. Tiny streams of pale blue light pulsed beneath its polished surface more rapidly than before. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "It was not doing that earlier," he said. Lyra swallowed. "No." She lifted trembling fingers toward the band, but stopped before touching it. "It only behaves this way when it detects something." Ethan looked around the workshop. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. The old radio remained silent on the shelf. The restored rocking chair rested beside the workbench. Outside, leaves drifted peacefully across the driveway. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, from somewhere far beyond the visible sky, a faint low vibration rolled through the evening air. It was so subtle that Ethan almost mistook it for distant thunder. The tools hanging neatly along the workshop wall quivered almost imperceptibly. Lyra closed her eyes. The color drained from her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was little more than a frightened whisper. "They have entered the atmosphere." The vibration faded as quietly as it had arrived, leaving the workshop wrapped once again in ordinary evening sounds. Crickets began their familiar chorus beyond the pasture, and somewhere near the fence line a wind chime stirred gently in the cooling air. Ethan listened for another tremor, but none came. He turned toward Lyra, whose attention remained fixed on the darkening sky beyond the garage window. The silver band around her neck pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm now, almost like a heartbeat. "Tell me what is happening," Ethan said calmly. "Not everything. Just enough, so I know how to help." Lyra remained silent for several seconds before lowering herself onto the old wooden stool beside his workbench. Her shoulders no longer carried only exhaustion. They carried the weight of a decision she had avoided for days. She folded her hands together, staring at the fine wood dust resting across her borrowed flannel sleeves. "When I was very young," she began softly, "I believed every life belonged to itself. My teachers disagreed." Ethan leaned quietly against the workbench without interrupting. "They taught that every citizen belongs first to the continuum. Family comes second. Duty comes before both." She looked toward the restored rocking chair, standing proudly beneath the workshop light. "On my world, children do not inherit dreams. They inherit responsibilities." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. "And yours?" Lyra smiled faintly, but there was no happiness in it. "Mine was decided before I could speak my own name." She gently touched the silver band. "This is not simply a locator. It is a covenant. It confirms my identity, records my decisions, and reminds everyone who sees it that my future has already been assigned." Ethan studied the elegant ring again. It seemed less like technology now and more like an invisible promise that could never be broken. "You said you ran away," he said quietly. "From what?" Lyra lifted her eyes to meet his. For the first time since they had met, there was no hesitation left. "From a throne." The words settled over the workshop more softly than falling snow. Ethan blinked once, unsure he had heard correctly. Lyra continued before he could ask another question. "My people govern 27 inhabited systems. Every generation produces one heir whose life belongs entirely to the continuum. That heir is expected to rule without personal attachments, without family, and without choosing anything for herself." She looked down at the calloused hands resting on her knees. "I was born into that future." Ethan glanced around his modest workshop. The old tools hanging on the wall, the shelves filled with repaired clocks, the worn coffee mug sitting beside a box of nails. Everything suddenly felt impossibly ordinary compared to the life she described. Yet she had chosen this place instead of unimaginable power. "You left all of that?" he asked. Lyra slowly nodded. "Not because I hated my people. Because I could no longer remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a symbol." The evening breeze slipped through the cracked workshop window, carrying with it the scent of drying leaves and distant pine. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Ethan walked toward the workbench and picked up the old family photograph that Lyra had admired the previous day. He looked at the smiling face of his father before placing the picture gently into her hands. "My father used to tell me something whenever I was afraid of making the wrong decision," he said. Lyra looked at the faded photograph with quiet curiosity. "What did he say?" Ethan smiled gently. "He said that titles tell people what you do. Character tells them who you are." Lyra read the sentence silently as though it belonged to a language she had never been taught. Her eyes glistened, but she did not look away. At that exact moment, the silver band flashed brighter than it ever had before. 3 clear pulses traveled around its polished surface before fading into a steady glow. Lyra's breathing caught. She closed her fingers around the photograph instinctively. "They know," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "Know what?" She slowly looked toward the ceiling, beyond the roof, beyond the clouds, toward something only she seemed able to sense. "They have stopped searching for someone lost," she said. "They have started coming for their princess." That night the valley felt unusually still, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The familiar sounds of insects faded one by one until only the soft crackling of the workshop stove remained. Ethan stepped outside just before midnight, carrying 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea. The air had turned colder, and a thin layer of frost already shimmered across the grass beneath the moonlight. Above him, thousands of stars stretched from one horizon to the other. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet after everything Lyra had shared, even the quiet sky no longer felt ordinary. She joined him a moment later, wrapping the oversized flannel shirt more tightly around herself. They stood beside the old fence without speaking, both looking upward. "Does your world have seasons?" Ethan finally asked. Lyra nodded slowly. Not like yours. Our climate is controlled. Storms are calculated. Harvests are scheduled decades in advance. Nothing is left to chance. Ethan smiled faintly. Sounds efficient. It is, she answered. It is also lonely. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles across the hillside. Ethan watched the branches sway naturally in the darkness. Around here, he said, we spend half our lives adapting to weather we cannot predict. Lyra looked toward the distant forest. Perhaps uncertainty teaches gratitude. Ethan quietly handed her one of the warm mugs. She accepted it with both hands, letting the heat warm her fingers before taking a careful sip. You always share warmth, she observed. First a blanket, then food. Now this. Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. People usually remember kindness longer than advice. Lyra lowered her eyes into the rising steam. Nobody in my world ever measured success that way. Before Ethan could answer, a faint ribbon of pale silver appeared high above the northern horizon. It was not bright enough to resemble lightning, nor fast enough to be a meteor. Instead, it drifted silently across the stars with impossible precision before stopping directly above the valley. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Do you see that? Lyra did not answer immediately. She already knew. The silver band around her neck brightened once again, bathing the collar of the flannel shirt in a soft blue glow. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with quiet resignation. They are waiting, she whispered. Ethan looked around the empty property. Waiting for what? For me to decide whether I will surrender willingly. Her voice remained calm, but the sadness behind it felt deeper than before. Ethan looked back toward the farmhouse, then toward the workshop where generations of repaired furniture rested beneath warm lights. Finally, he faced Lyra again. Nobody gets to make that decision except you. She turned toward him with visible surprise. You do not understand what refusing means. Ethan nodded gently. Maybe not, but I understand what choosing means. She searched his face as though hoping to find fear there instead of quiet conviction. What she found was the same steady expression he had worn the night they first met behind the garage. He was not pretending to know her world. He simply believed that every person deserved ownership of their own life. Lyra looked down at the silver band once more. My advisors always said that humans were emotionally unpredictable. They warned that your compassion often overruled logic. Ethan smiled. They were probably right. A tiny laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It lasted only a moment, but it carried genuine warmth instead of uncertainty. Then her smile slowly faded. If I return, she said softly, I become the woman they expect me to be. If I stay, countless people may lose the leader they have prepared their entire lives to follow. Ethan remained silent for several long seconds before pointing toward the restored rocking chair visible through the workshop window. When I rebuilt that chair, I could have made it look brand new. Lyra followed his gaze. But you did not. No, Ethan replied. I left the old marks because they are part of its story. They do not weaken it. They remind people that it survived. Lyra stared thoughtfully at the chair glowing beneath the workshop light. Slowly she understood. A leader shaped only by duty could command obedience. A leader shaped by compassion could inspire hope. High above the valley, the silver light remained perfectly still, watching without descending. For the first time since leaving her distant home, Lyra no longer wondered whether she should run. She began wondering what kind of queen she could become after learning how ordinary kindness had quietly changed her forever. Dawn arrived wrapped in silver mist, covering the valley with the same quiet beauty that had greeted Ethan every autumn for as long as he could remember. Yet this morning the silence carried expectation instead of peace. The pale light above the northern sky had remained motionless throughout the night, never approaching, never leaving, waiting with impossible patience. Ethan stood beside the old wooden fence holding 2 warm mugs, although he already knew only one would be used. Lyra stepped out of the workshop wearing the borrowed flannel shirt beneath her silver cloak, now flickering less frequently, as if it somehow sensed the journey ahead. She stopped beside him and looked across the fields glowing beneath the first rays of sunrise. This is the first sunrise I have ever watched simply because I wanted to, she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. Then it was worth staying for. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. They simply watched golden light spill across the grass while birds welcomed another ordinary day. Finally, the silver band around Lyra's neck released one clear tone unlike any sound Ethan had ever heard. It was neither mechanical nor musical. It felt ancient. A narrow column of soft white light descended silently into the open pasture beyond the garage. There was no explosion, no roar, no display of overwhelming force. The light simply rested upon the earth with quiet certainty. 3 figures emerged from within it, dressed in flowing white ceremonial garments trimmed with threads of living silver. Their faces revealed neither anger nor triumph. They walked with calm dignity until they stopped several yards from Ethan and Lyra. The oldest among them lowered his head respectfully before speaking in perfectly clear English. "Your Highness, the Continuum has come to bring you home." Lyra remained still. Her fingers tightened slightly around the faded family photograph Ethan had given her. The elder finally noticed it and frowned with quiet curiosity. "You carry an object of sentimental value?" She nodded. "Yes. It was not issued by the Royal Archives." "No. Then why preserve it?" Lyra looked toward Ethan before answering. "Because it reminds me of the kind of leader I wish to become." The elder studied her in thoughtful silence. "You have changed." "I have," Lyra replied. "I learned something my education never taught me." She slowly removed the photograph from her pocket and held it carefully against her heart. A civilization is not measured by how perfectly it controls its people. It is measured by how deeply its people choose to care for one another. The valley fell silent once again. Even the morning wind seemed to pause. The elder looked toward Ethan, who said nothing at all. He neither defended himself nor demanded anything in return. He simply stood beside the weathered fence where he had welcomed a frightened stranger only days earlier. The elder's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Human Ethan Carter," he said quietly. "Our records identify you as a carpenter." Ethan nodded. "That is right." The elder looked toward the other 2 guardians before speaking again. "For generations, the Continuum believed loyalty could be commanded. During your Highness's absence, the High Council has debated whether that belief has made us stronger or merely more obedient. Scholars, commanders, historians, and citizens from every inhabited system were heard before a final judgment was reached. Yesterday, for the first time in our recorded history, the Council voted unanimously to amend the Covenant of Succession." He slowly raised one hand. "No heir shall ever again wear a covenant without freely accepting its burden. A ruler chosen by fear may preserve an empire. A ruler who chooses freely may deserve one." Before Ethan could respond, the silver band surrounding Lyra's neck released a final gentle pulse before unlocking itself for the first time in her life. It separated into 2 delicate pieces and drifted silently into the elder's waiting hands. No chains remained. No commands followed. Only freedom. Lyra turned toward Ethan with tears shining openly in her golden eyes. "The first night we met," she said softly, "I asked you not to send me back." Ethan remembered every word. "I know." She smiled through those tears, stronger now than when she had first hidden behind the garage. "You never did. You helped me find the courage to return on my own." She stepped forward and embraced him briefly, not as a princess honoring a citizen, but as one grateful soul thanking another. Moments later, she entered the waiting column of light. It rose soundlessly into the morning sky before disappearing beyond the clouds. Months passed. Winter surrendered to spring, and spring welcomed another Montana summer. Life returned to familiar rhythms until one quiet evening Ethan heard a gentle knock behind the garage. He opened the old wooden door and froze. A small silver shuttle rested in the pasture without guards, without ceremony, and without fear. Lyra stood beside it wearing simple traveling clothes instead of royal robes. Around her neck there was no silver band, only a small wooden pendant carved from the same oak Ethan had used to restore the rocking chair. She smiled with complete peace and said, "The council asked where the new law truly began. I told them it did not begin inside a royal chamber. It began behind an old garage in Montana, where an ordinary human treated a frightened stranger like a person instead of a symbol." Ethan quietly stepped aside and held the door open exactly as he had on the first night. This time she did not whisper in fear. She walked forward with confidence, crossed the threshold by her own choice. And as the evening sun illuminated the weathered garage walls, Ethan noticed something engraved on the wooden pendant resting against her heart. It was not the crest of the continuum. It was the simple outline of a weathered garage. Every child in the continuum would one day learn its meaning as the symbol of the first choice accord. The moment an ordinary act of human kindness forever changed the oldest law of 27 star systems. Lyra looked around the familiar workshop, breathed in the scent of cedar and fresh sawdust, and smiled. Home,